Colonist Booker Smith, UNS Lightbringer. Leaving Earth should have been the hardest decision I ever had to make, abandoning my family and friends in some vain hope that another world might host me. As I loaded myself into my cryopod, however, the only emotion I could bring myself to feel was relief. Relief that I wouldn't be made to watch as the flame of mankind petered out and died. Relief that Mum and Dad would have one less offspring to worry about, as every family on Earth struggled to survive. My going away wasn't supposed to be that big of a deal, but Mum insisted on throwing a party. Everyone in the family and on the block gathered together to celebrate. Dad even made a cake. Apparently, the eggs alone had run him back over £100. Honestly, with how excited everyone was, you'd think I'd won the lottery, and in a way, I suppose I did. Near the end of the party, I was presented with a variety of gifts to take with me on the journey to humanity's next home. My secondary school sweetheart, Annabelle, and her wife, Shannon, got me a box of American snack cakes, a guilty pleasure of mine. Most food items would go bad long before the Lightbringer reached its destination, but to call the snack cakes food in the first place was in itself being pretty generous. Whatever real ingredients these things once used had long since been replaced by chemical substitutes, making them no less delicious and a little bit more carcinogenic than the original. Uncle Buck was a historian and collector, so of course his gift would be the most interesting. Holding the antique pirate cutlass in my hands, I was dumbfounded. This thing had come straight from his personal collection and was among the most valuable artifacts housed there. Apparently, real museums had offered him good money for it in the past, but he always refused. "I wanted to give you something you might use up there," he joked, looking upon me with pride as I holstered the weapon in its custom sheath and set it aside atop the small pile of parting presents. The final gift given to me at that party had apparently been a combined effort by everyone there, a signed scrapbook containing images of Earth's greatest cities and most stunning monuments. Something to show my kids when asked about Earth, they said. I had done my best throughout the event not to cry, but that little book was the final straw. At that moment, it sank in with me that my children would never get to set foot on Earth. They would never meet their grandparents or see Buckingham Palace. To them, these things would only be as real as the stories we brought with us. No longer could I hold back the torrent of emotions building up inside. For most of my life, I hadn't been sure if I even wanted children of my own. I always told myself that once I met the right person, we would discuss it together. In order to undertake this mission, however, all colonists in the United Kingdom were obligated to sign the UN-drafted Eden Contract, essentially waiving our reproductive rights to ensure a growing population for the colony. Back when this prerequisite was first unveiled, many people throughout the country were quick to denounce it as barbaric. Their cries of injustice, however, fell upon deaf ears. When the survival of humanity is at stake, fairness goes out the window pretty damn fast. Cryosleep wasn't at all what I had been expecting. Even in the vaguest sense of the word, calling it sleep was a total misnomer. While on ice, brain activity was practically non-existent, discounting entirely the possibility of dreams. Waking up, I didn't exactly feel well rested either. The overall sensation was less akin to sleep than it was to blinking in slow motion, closing my eyes while our ship was on the launch pad in Birmingham, and opening them back up on another world entirely. Aerosolized CRISPR viruses filled my lungs as I breathed in deeply to better accommodate their integration into my bloodstream. Now that we had reached our destination, the frog genes allowing for cryosleep had outlived their usefulness, and as such needed to be removed. Concluding my breathing exercises with a sigh of relief, I watched as at last my pod's frosted-over lid lifted away to unveil my surroundings. Standing in a half-circle around me were 4 individuals, 2 of whom were security troops decked out in full tactical gear with visors concealing their faces. "Sleep well?" asked one of the colonists, twirling around a lock of her wavy red hair as she called out to me in a sing-song, almost mocking tone. "Like a fucking rock," I groaned sarcastically, attempting a graceful exit of the pod, only to be foiled by a betrayal from my own legs, depositing me face first onto the cold steel floor in front of them. Embarrassing as it was, the gaff didn't hurt nearly as much as it would have back home on account of this planet's lower gravity. "Let me guess, I'm part of the landing party, aren't I?" Stepping forth to assist me in regaining my footing, one of the soldiers nodded in reply. "Lucky you." He chuckled from beneath his helmet, gesturing with his free hand toward the cubby beside my pod. Now for the love of God, put some clothes on. Breakfast is in 5, then we're headed out. As it turned out, the promise of food was just what my body needed to kick back into gear. Throwing on a t-shirt and sliding Buck's cutlass into the belt loop of my jeans, never know when you might need something like that, I quickly staggered forth into the captain's quarters to enjoy my first meal in over a century. I'd never actually had beans on toast before, but I'll readily admit the dish made a strong first impression. As it turns out, when you're on the verge of starvation, anything edible tastes like the best thing you've eaten. Both of the security troops had removed their helmets in order to eat with the rest of us, revealing beneath them 2 figures who looked like polar opposites. The short, dark hair, with matching skin and deep, almost completely black eyes, of one superficially at odds with the pale blonde mane and bright blue irises of the other. So, began the brown-eyed individual, his voice marking him as the one who had helped me up previously. Since we're going to be working together for a little while, we might as well introduce ourselves. I'm Commodore Jonathan Fernsby of the Royal Navy, but I'm not that full of myself, so you all can just call me John. Following the lead of his fellow soldier, the other security troop was next to introduce himself. Boris Villain, he shrugged, extending a hand for the lot of us to take turns shaking. A pleasure to be working with you all. Emma Welsh, smiled the red-headed woman as she shook Boris's hand. You lot can call me Em if you like. Immediately following Em's introduction, the 60-something-year-old man beside her extended his palm toward Boris and spoke. Captain Lewis, he began, confirming my initial impression of him as the ship's commander. I've been maintaining this vessel for 40 years following our previous captain's death. Thanks for getting us here, Pops, grinned Boris, taking the captain's hand and initiating a hearty shake. Now it's your turn to sit back and enjoy the ride. Awkwardly gulping down the last bite of my toast, I watched as in eerie unison, all eyes fell upon me. Thinking back on it, I probably looked quite strange with a literal sword hung at my side, but in that moment, my social awkwardness had overridden any and all self-awareness. I stammered, my eyes rapidly moving between the 4 other colonists, as I clumsily composed an introduction. Name's Booker. There probably aren't many other Bookers on board, so the last name's kinda irrelevant, isn't it? Suspicious as that probably sounded, thankfully none of the others deigned to call me out on it. Instead, I watched as John rose to his feet and dusted off the crumbs from his body armor. All right, everyone, no time for faffing about. Lewis, are you all right staying here on the ship while the rest of us scout out the area for a bit? I've stayed on this bloody ship for 4 decades, the captain shrugged. I don't imagine a few more hours will hurt too terribly. Good to hear. Everyone else gear up. We need to be ready for whatever we find out there, concluded John, as the rest of us set aside our empty plates and started toward the storage room to retrieve our exploration gear. Lucky for us, we had been assigned to one of the earliest Dandelion Initiative colony vessels, unaffected by the tightening budget that would later result in cut corners on other ships. So, Em, I began, slinging a backpack full of camping supplies over my shoulder as I approached the redhead. What are you planning to do once the colony is set up? Contemplating for a moment my awkward inquiry as she carefully surveyed the contours of her emergency pistol, soon enough Emma replied, Probably farming. At least there I can put my botany degree to good use, right? Better a botanist than a hairdresser. I grinned cheekily, holding up my middle and pointer fingers, before repeatedly pulling them together in a scissoring motion. It was a damn good thing the UK used a lotto system rather than merit-based selection. Otherwise, I'd never have made it on board. Proud as I was of my profession, I held no illusions of it being at all useful out here in the galactic Wild West. Don't feel too bad, Em smiled mischievously, tucking the gun into her waistband before fully turning her attention towards me. You'll be a lifesaver when the humidity fucks up my hair. Friendly banter aside, soon enough it came time for us 4 to venture out onto the planet's surface. Taking in a deep breath to steel myself for this upcoming ordeal, I watched in silent anticipation as Boris pulled down the airlock release lever. Warm, humid air washed over us despite the total lack of daylight, suggesting that the location we now found ourselves in was somewhere near this planet's equator. Silhouettes of tall, tree-like organisms stood silently at the edge of our vessel's light, looming ominously over our scouting party. Sifting about within the explorer's bag mounted upon my back, Eventually my fingers coiled around the cylindrical metal body of a torch, or flashlight for Americans. Immediately producing the tool, I fumbled about a bit for the on switch, before at last flicking into existence a bright beam of electrical light focused upon the silent legion of trees around us. I nearly screamed. Gasps resounded out from my fellow scouts as the lot of us finally got a good look at these plants for what they truly were. Grey, mottled skin like that of an elephant draped the bodies of these stationary flesh towers, their monochromatic canvas interrupted only by dripping red scabs. Turning on the built-in torch of his rifle, Boris angled it skyward for a better look at what we had previously mistaken for branches. Far from resembling the limbs of a tree, however, these offshoots from the central body bore certain sickening similarities to those of a human. Long, nail-less fingers stretched out from seemingly random locations along each branch in a gruesome mockery of Earth's trees. "Holy shit," Em whispered quietly, as though afeared these abominations might hear us, and for all we knew, they could. Defying John's orders to keep back from these organisms, Emma instead stepped forth for a closer look. Ultimately, morbid curiosity overwhelmed my sense, prompting me to do the same. All the while, Boris's rifle remained trained upon this tree as a precaution should it decide to make a move against us. Carefully stepping toward the nearest of these organisms, I cringed as the acrid scent of iron stung at my nostrils. At last, drawing within arm's length of this creature, I saw its flesh rise and fall in a slow but steady rhythm. "It's breathing!" I gasped. "Are these things plants or animals?" Boris asked, tentatively looking to the botanist for answers. "This isn't Earth," Em replied matter-of-factly, reaching out as though to caress the flesh stump before thinking better of it, and retracting her hand. "Words like that are totally meaningless here, approximations at best." Clearly, this was not the answer our security trooper had wanted. "Make an approximation then," he demanded, his tone more of anxiety than anger. "If I had to guess," Em sighed, looking upon the organisms with visible uncertainty, "I'd say functionally closer to animals, maybe fungus?" Clearing his throat in an effort to reclaim our attention, it was John who at last returned us to business. "Regardless, they don't seem hostile," he shrugged, carefully scanning the woods around us in search for any anomalous movements. "Let's split into two groups. Em and I are going to go east. Boris and Booker, you two go west. We meet back here in 2 hours. All clear?" "Crystal," I shrugged, seeing no good reason to question the Commodore's logic. With one armed security trooper in either group, we would more than likely be safe from any threats posed by local wildlife. Waving a cordial goodbye to Emma and John, I quickly broke into a jog in order to keep pace with Boris, who had already taken off. Even back home, where the sounds were familiar and the trees weren't made of flesh, I always found forests to be especially unnerving at night. Buried deep within the human psyche, there lingered a primal fear of places like this, wilderness locales where once upon a time our evolutionary predecessors were stalked and killed by all manner of beast. Here, amongst this alien terrain, every new sound plucked at my nerves more so than the last, hastening my heartbeat into an ancestral chorus of voices, commanding me to run. Nary a word was spoken between myself and Boris, as we quietly trekked through this sick parody of a woodland. Keeping close to the security trooper, I allowed him to lead the way, carefully scanning the surrounding area with my flashlight in search of any shape lingering amongst the trees. Powerful gusts of wind whistled across the landscape of fleshy alien foliage, jostling limbs overhead with a sound like the cracking of a million knuckles. Half an hour or so into our journey, the ghastly tree line we'd been traversing gave way to a steep ridge. Rather than change course, however, Boris merely lingered at the cliff's edge, falling as still as the plants around us. "Booker, are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Taking a step closer to the overlook, my eyes went wide as far below us I saw the distinctive glow of electric lights set against walls of worked stone. Around this building, dozens of what looked to be humans were wandering about, as speakers mounted upon metal poles droned out announcements in a language foreign to my Cogitalinks database. I didn't know what exactly to make of this discovery, and judging by his lack of movement, neither did Boris. Perhaps humanity had finally cracked FTL travel and settled here before we arrived. Or maybe the private colonists had gotten here first and set up a base. Neither of those conclusions made any sense, however. Humans don't just invent new languages in a few years with no trace of the old ones. Whatever tongue was being spoken over the PA system had no relation to any language on Earth. We lingered in that area for a long time, allowing our grims to collect language data as we looked down upon the mysterious facility. Barbed wire fences surrounded the building's perimeter, behind which dozens of these figures could be seen toiling away like slaves. Built into each of the fence's four corners stood watchtowers, and from atop them we could occasionally see the swiveling lights, presumably mounted to rifles not unlike Boris's. When first we saw torch beams shining in the near distance just off to our left, I had foolishly assumed it was just John and Em wandering over to us by sheer coincidence. Peering past the myriad stumps of flesh standing between our two groups, however, I could feel my throat drying up with each extraneous light I counted, going up to a total of 5. Instinct rapidly took control of my body as I turned off the torch I held and dove behind one of the animal trees, quickly syncing up my breathing with its own. Fortunately, Boris required no encouragement to follow my lead, flicking off the light at the end of his rifle and diving into a patch of long grass with the texture of human hair. As our new acquaintances drew ever nearer, finally I got a good look at them, illuminated partially by the light of their own weapon-mounted torches. I can't say for sure what tipped me off that they weren't human. Maybe it was those slightly too long arms that clung to their flashlights, or perhaps it was the way their hair remained stationary in spite of the heavy breeze. Overall, however, it wasn't the differences that unnerved me so much as the similarities. If I had seen these creatures in a crowd on Earth, I'd have thought nothing of them. Here, however, in a setting this alien, my preconceived notions of normal had long since melted away. Continuing to encroach upon our hiding places, eventually the 5 creatures stopped just a dozen or so meters shy of our location. Murmuring amongst themselves for a short while, soon enough my Cogitolink had sufficient language data to approximate what they were saying to each other. "Whatever that device was, it landed in this area," one of them hissed to the others, his gun's sight momentarily coming far too close to our hiding spot before eventually shifting, its monocular gaze elsewhere. "Fan out and search for it. Remember, anyone found to be trespassing within 1 mile of a re-education camp is to be shot on sight." "Yes, sir," the others repeated in robotic unison. And on that very note, the 5 of them dispersed in differing directions. Unfortunately for me and Boris, one of those directions just so happened to be directly toward us.